Hello, everybody. Just to reintroduce myself, my name is Avril Keating, and I'm the director of the UCL Centre for Global Youth. I want to welcome you along today to the first in our new webinar series on youth mobility, which I'm organising along with Sazana Jayadeva, who has just recently joined sociology at the University of Cambridge, and Rachel Benchikroon, who works with me at UCL. As you may know or may have already heard, we are recording this session, and the session will be posted up on our YouTube channel later this week. So the aim of this series, just to give you a bit of background, is to look at youth mobility experiences and how they differ around the world. We wanted to look at not just international student mobility or international mobility, but also internal mobility to see if there's any similarities or differences that we need to tease out. So over the course of about 5 weeks, we want to look at drivers and motivations, the consequences of mobility for youth experiences, identities and transitions, and also to see the current context for mobility, youth mobility experiences. For example, has COVID changed things? So what we will be doing over the next 5 weeks between now and the 1st of June is hosting 5 seminars on youth mobilities. This week, we're starting with India, but we'll also be looking at China, Australia, the UK, and the very particular experiences of young people who are coming from a refugee background. You can find out more about all of the series through the UCL Global Youth blog. But of course, this week we're going to be starting with India and youth experiences there. I want to introduce the speakers just very briefly, so I don't take up too much time. And first of all, just to welcome Professor Carol Upadhya, who is from NIAS in India. Carol, you're going to be speaking today with Supriya RoyChowdhury. Has Supriya managed to make her way into the Zoom room yet?
She hasn't, but she's trying. So anyway, I'm presenting, so it's okay. Maybe she can join us in a bit.
Okay. And this will be the first presentation, and Carol and Supriya will be looking at migrant service workers and their migration within India. And then after that presentation, we'll turn to Peidong Yang, who's joining us from Singapore today and the Nanyang Technological University. Welcome, very much, welcome. And Peidong will be looking at Indian medical students moving to China. The format for today that the speakers will get about 15 minutes each to present some of their current research. Then after that, we will have a brief discussant comments from Sazana Jayadeva. And then after that, we will have lots and lots of times for question and answers. Please feel free to add your questions into the chat along the side as the presentations go on. And then at the end, we'll read them out, or you can raise your hand and ask any questions that you wish to do. Okay? I already think I've taken up far too much of your time. So I'm going to pass over to Carol Upadhya and Supriya RoyChowdhury, who will be talking about migrant service workers in Bengaluru. Thank you so much, Carol and Supriya. I'm especially grateful for you taking the time to talk to us today, because I know that the situation in India is very grave, and I hope that your friends and family are doing okay.
Thank you, thank you. And thanks to all of you for inviting us to share our work in this webinar series. I will just plunge right in and share my screen. Is it visible?
Yes.
Whoops. Why is it not becoming free? 1 second. Okay. There we go. Okay, so it's hard to, this talk is based on a 2-year study that Supriya and I did together. And in fact, Sazana worked on this project for a period of time also. Difficult to summarize everything in a short presentation. So I'm trying to stick to a few key points about speaking to the theme of the webinar, which is on youth mobility. And just to start out, for those of you who may not be very familiar with India, there's a kind of common perception, a popular perception, which is also underscored by some academic studies, which says that young people from rural areas and small towns mostly have a strong desire to move out of agriculture and out of those more provincial places and come to the city, which is seen as the place where you can actually fulfill your aspirations. But the study that we did, which was on kind of less privileged rural migrants moving into the service economy in Bangalore, really complicates that story. And I want to just make a few key arguments as to why I think we need to rethink a little bit questions about both spatial and social mobility together. And to start with a little bit of background, again, for not all of you may be very familiar with India. Since economic reforms were brought in the 1990s, India experienced high rates of economic growth. But at the same time, there's been a pattern of deindustrialization, especially in cities like Bangalore, and a concomitant growth in the service sector. So while the service sector now contributes more than half to India's GDP, employment has not grown commensurately, and therefore it's not producing the kind of employment that one would wish, especially in the context of growing youth unemployment, which is a major crisis in the country. Part of this growth, in a very small part actually, is what's called the new service economy, or organized services. And so we are shifting from a situation where services were being provided mainly through informal sector activities to more organized and corporatized services in a whole range of activities such as retail, hospitality, housekeeping, security, transportation, and so on. And so these are the kind of jobs which are now available in the city. And they do tend to attract young people from smaller towns and rural areas to take up these kind of jobs, such as taxi drivers, platform drivers, delivery boys, and so on. And so this is a really important new category of employment for India, but it's something which has not been extensively studied by social scientists. So we really lack any kind of macro level data on which to draw to paint a picture of employment and migration in this sector. Even though, of course, these service workers are highly visible in the cities, we also don't know much about their backgrounds or their conditions of work and so on. I want to just briefly say something, try to contextualize what I'm going to say a bit later about our findings within two bodies of literature. And I should first preface that and say that we are still trying to work on publications from this project. And so I'm casting around for ways in which to link our findings to broader debates. And therefore very much look forward to your suggestions and comments. So the first is, of course, we have a very large literature on migration in India and elsewhere, and particularly on labor migration, where a lot of the focus has been on much more on the migration of skilled, semi-skilled and unskilled workers from rural areas into sectors like construction and industry in the cities, where you see a pattern of circular migration. And this is something which, of course, came in the news a lot last year when the lockdown was imposed in India, and there were all these migrant workers stranded in cities like Bangalore. So we have quite a lot of, understanding of that level of migration. On the other hand, we have quite a few studies in the post-liberalization period focused on really what you might call the middle class, looking at urbanization and social mobility and youth aspirations in the context of a booming economy, where many more people were in some sense able to enter the middle class by getting educated and then moving into professions like IT or into call centers and work like that. So a lot of the literature on the sociological literature has focused on this kind of a movement, and it's revolved around questions of, again, aspiration, of the formation of new subjectivities and so on. But what we looked at in our study and what we were really interested in is a different segment of the workforce, and particularly the migrant workforce, which I just described, which are people coming into these service sector jobs. One reason why they are distinguished from both these categories I just spoke about is because for a lot of the kind of jobs I'm talking about, they require basically a minimum of a 10th standard education, that is a high school education. So whereas a lot of labor migrants, say construction workers, would not have studied up to that level, these are young people who have achieved at least 10th or 12th standard, but their backgrounds are such that they really don't have the kind of cultural capital that you would need to get into much more kind of lucrative and stable, desirable jobs in the city. And so this is why you find them in these kinds of occupations. So the question for us really is, who are these people? Where do they come from? What is their experience of work? What kinds of patterns of mobility do we see in this segment of the workforce? And what does it tell us about questions of class restructuring and class formation in the current scenario? So just to give a bit of background about the study, and the city, Bangalore, as I said, has undergone a kind of a period of deindustrialization over the last 2 or 3 decades, a very rapid expansion of the middle class, driven largely by the location of the IT industry here, and the growth of various consumption-oriented services around that. One of the interesting things about this new service economy, or these different types of services that we talk about, is that even though the conditions of employment remain rather informal, they are very much in the corporate sector, and the labor market is increasingly organized through private training and placement agencies. And so we located our study mostly in skill training centers in Bangalore, because it had appeared to us that these are major actors in kind of creating streams or bringing young people into the city and giving them a kind of very modest kind of a skill training, and then putting them into these service sector jobs in the city. So most of the research was in Bangalore, and then there was a segment also in RoyChowdhury district in the north of the state, from which a lot of the migrants were coming. So as I said, that we were interested in how these skill training centers, and the ones we worked with, 3 of them were NGOs and one was a for-profit private center. So even the NGOs, they are trying to serve a social mission of poverty alleviation, providing employment to underprivileged youth, and so on. But what they are really actually end up doing, what we found, is that they're really facilitating the production of this new kind of workforce by bringing underprivileged youth from remote rural areas and giving them some basic training, and then putting them into jobs in the city. So one of the interesting points that we found about these skill training centers is that they claim that they're targeting what's called BPL, below poverty line households, because their objective is, as I said, to kind of provide a level of social mobility to these young people. But the cohort of students that we could gather information on show that in fact they don't belong to the poorest of the poor in the village. They are certainly not well off, but they don't belong to the lowest social class. And so the question is really with this cohort of students that we studied is, what are their experiences in the city with the training once they come here and once they get placed in jobs? This is just a visual of the kind of the ways in which these NGOs represent themselves or think about what it is they're trying to do when they engage in skill training. I forgot to mention that these centers, mostly the skill training courses they offer, are oriented to service sector jobs. So things like beautician, driver, back office, customer support worker, and so on. One of the things that they engage in, because they actually find it quite difficult to convince young people to come to the city to undertake training, even though it's offered for free, and even though they guarantee job job placement, is that there's a lot of reluctance on the part of families to send their kids to these programs. And so they engage in a lot of what they call mobilization work in the villages to convince these young people to come to the city for training. The training practices I don't have time to go into, except to say that a lot of it is really, even though they are supposed to be imparting job-oriented skills, a lot of what they do is really what's called soft skills, which is providing, certain, basically the idea is to kind of rework their subjectivities and, equip them with the right kinds of soft skills and attitudes that they need to manage in the city and to manage in a corporate workplace. Which is, environments that are very unfamiliar to them. This is just an example of the kind of course content which is there in one of the courses called Administrative Assistant. One of the big motivations for these rural young people to come to the courses is that they are promised some training in English, in spoken English, and also in computers. And these are the two skills that they believe are going to help them in their future careers. They are not much interested in the other things or the particular jobs in which they're being trained for, but these are the motivating forces for them. So again, this is just an example of the kind of, in the sense, the orientation of these skilled courses, and what they are trying to do is really create better lives for these young people. So what really happens then, long story short, is that what we found is really a very deep mismatch between what students expected to learn and what they expected from the jobs they got and what actually happened. And we found, for example, that just 1 or 2 months after job placement, we tried to follow up with the students afterwards, that more than half of them we couldn't even locate. They had left the job, they had left Bangalore, and gone somewhere else. And a couple of reasons for this. One is the high cost of living and the high cost of rent in the city. And this is information from the ones we were able to place. But more than that was really disappointment with the type of jobs they got, the type of work that was there, the salary level, and so on. What we really see here is the creation of really a very footloose labor force. And it's not only the skill centers which are doing this, of course. We have to look at the conditions of employment in these large companies that employ really huge numbers of young people with a very high level of attrition and job rotation, in which they are basically moving from place to place and job to job, looking for something slightly better. And yet most of these jobs really don't have any type of a clear career path. So that is the other reason why they move around quite a lot. And very often we find them going home again. And that is why I started out by saying that, the findings of this study really challenge this notion that there is this kind of urban dream amongst the rural youth. What I'm saying is that for young people of a particular social class who really don't have the social and cultural capital to make it in the city, but who are being brought to work in these kinds of very dead-end, low-end jobs, the city is not their dream. In fact, their dream is to be back in the village and hope to make a decent living there, close to their families, which is of course quite difficult given the kind of uneven nature of growth and development in India. Sajana and I are out of time probably, right? Should I wind up here? Am I out of time? I just wanted to say maybe 1 minute about the aspirations
Carol,
that they
you
do
have
have.
about 2 minutes left, so don't worry.
Okay.
Very good.
Yeah, I just have 2 slides, I think. So one of the things that the leaders of these skill centers often said is that these young people that come from rural areas, they don't have aspirations. They're not ambitious, and we have to raise their aspirations. And that is why they put a lot of effort into kind of, giving them pep talks and, telling them about how great the job will be when they get there and so on. But what we found is that it's not true that they don't have aspirations. They articulated all kinds of aspirations to us. And these are just some examples on the screen. What they don't aspire to do is to be an Uber driver or a Swiggy driver or, work in some crappy job in a retail store standing on their feet the whole day. So the problem for them really is to be able to forge a career path that's going to actually lead to something, lead to a better life, and that you know, preferably would not be in Bangalore, would be somewhere closer to home. And of course, many of them articulated this is a very common desire amongst young people across India, which is the ultimate goal for many of them is to get a government job, right? Because a government job is something which is permanent, it's stable, it provides decent salary and benefits. It is something which is very hard to get, but even something like a lowly police constable is better than the kind of work that I was just talking about. And so to me, that suggests that, you know, that these young people are not unaspirational, but they don't aspire, they aspire for something much more stable and which they can see a future in, as opposed to what's being offered to them through these current kind of skill training programs. And I think this is something from a more policy perspective that needs to be looked at, that the current trajectory of both the economy in terms of the types of employment that's on offer, as well as the ways in which skill training is being done, is really not helping young people from marginalized households to achieve these kinds of dreams that they talked about. So these are just some concluding points. I think I've mentioned most of this. One of the things I'm interested in thinking through with this research is how do we actually, you know, define or locate them in terms of class? As I mentioned two other classes, one you could call working class, who are also highly mobile, and then there's the middle class, which are also mobile in their own way, often transnationally mobile, which I think we'll hear about in a minute. And this is a group which somehow falls in between, and I'm kind of thinking through how do we really define them in relation to these other groups. And it's obviously quite fluid and something which is hard to kind of pin down. The other important point, which seems really obvious in general, is that if we're going to talk about youth mobility in a place like India, we really have to examine these different patterns of both spatial and social mobility in relation to sharpening inequalities in contemporary India, whether it's of region, gender, caste, education, and so on. And I think there's a lot more work to be done to really look at how youth from these type of disadvantaged backgrounds navigate this terrain of employment and education, both which are extremely unequal and always shifting, and also recognize that maybe their ambition is actually to become less mobile rather than more mobile. Okay, so that's the end. Some acknowledgements. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Carol. That's absolutely fascinating insight, and I think I can already see some connections with some of the work in the UK as well. I'm now going to invite our next speaker to start loading his presentation slides, if of course you have any.
Yes,
welcome,
I do.
Peidong Yang.
Okay, let me share my slides first. Okay, is the slides being shared?
They are starting.
In a second, I think it's a...
Okay.
We'll let you know once they're up.
Right. It says it's paused for some reason. Okay, let me try again. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
All right, is it on?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you for this opportunity. I just first like to thank the organizer for inviting me to this this webinar, and it's a privilege to be here and to speak after Carol, who is really an expert on migration in India. Before I began this, I had I had thought of three caveats that I wanted to offer, but I think now I have four. So the first is that this paper is based on a paper that the talk is based on the paper that I published in 2018, and given the limited speaking time, I have to omit a lot of details. So if you're interested, please do check out this paper, and feel free to email me if you have difficulty getting hold of one. So that's the first caveat. The second is that this study was conducted between 2014 and 2016 in terms of the empirical field work. So it is a little bit dated by now, and I haven't really been able to follow through with the situation, as much as I would like to. So it is a little dated in terms of its empirical data. So that's the second caveat. And the third one is that, and most importantly, this study was conducted obviously pre-COVID, and COVID has really transformed, tremendously impacted and the landscape of international student mobility, the thing, the topic that I'm working on. And I think, China, India, in international student mobility is no exception. I think I would not be surprised at all if this particular form of student mobility from India to China might drop to zero, this year, just looking at how situations are now. And I also have a lot of doubts as to whether this particular form of student mobility I'm going to talk to you about in the next 15 minutes is going to continue into the future. I have a lot of doubts about it. I think this is something we can talk about in relation to what we observe of COVID as we experience them. Now, the fourth caveat that I just thought of was that I'm by no means an expert in India studies or about India. In fact, I just happen to be someone who was researching on student mobility, and I focused on Chinese students particularly. But I came upon this case of Indian students in China because I was from China, and I observed this in a locale that I was familiar with. So I understand in the audience there are a lot of, by looking at the name, I think there's a significant Indian audience or people who are familiar with India. So do pardon me if I'm, I speak as someone who is very amateurish about India, and I would like to learn a lot from this. Okay, so let me dive into this. A little bit of background about China as a receiving country of international student mobility. So you may or may not know that China had prior to COVID, had become the world's third largest receiving country of international students. The Chinese government in 2010 came up with this very ambitious target of hosting 500,000 students by 2020. And by 2018, this target was apparently almost hit. Now, of course, COVID has, rendered everything here that you see on the slides pretty much meaningless, I would say. It's fascinating to try to crystal ball, gaze into what's the future of student mobility, particularly in relation to China. So that's something I'd be quite keen to talk with you about if you're interested in as well. So next, so China as a receiving country was the context in which this study is situated. Now, in China's rising profile as an international, as a host of international students, there is this particular phenomenon of programs being offered by second and third tier Chinese universities, usually located in the provincial towns, offering English medium MBBS programs to international students from countries that are, shall we say, ranked lower than China in global socioeconomic hierarchy. I think that's natural because you can hardly imagine, American or British citizen coming to China to study an English medium MBBS program, and those programs do have certain, at least based on my case observation, certain quality issues, which I'll go into talk about a little bit later. But anyway, so what you see on the screen here is the over the last 14 years, the sort of a program size and recruitment sort of numbers that we saw in China, started from early 2000. I couldn't pin down the exact beginning, but by the early 2000s, there were 2,000 universities offering about 2,000 places. The peak year was about 2013, 2014, when 50 plus universities offered about 6,000 places for MBBS program in that year. And my fieldwork took place in 2014 and to 2016. So I sort of managed to kind of study the sort of zenith or the peak of this phenomenon. And then you could see from about 2014, 2015 on, the number of places being offered had started to decline. And I think the most recent number this year is, about 3,000, which is only half of what was in the peak. And given COVID, I think we are in a very precarious situation. I think it is not impossible that this whole thing may just collapse. This whole phenomenon may just cease to exist. That is all within the realm of possibility. So among all these, about every year 3,000 places, empirical evidence suggests that most of the places do go to Indian students, although there are students from many other nationality sort of backgrounds. So we're talking about South Asia in general, so Nepal, Bangladesh, Bhutan, then we have African students as well. But based on my observation, Indian students do make up quite a significant percentage of these. So this is the general sort of background of this form of student mobility. Now in India, media has actually, noticed this happening. So, the Hindu in 2000, this is in 2006, they noticed that hundreds of Indian students were already going to China for these English medium MBBS programs hosted in second tier, third tier Chinese universities. And next, by 2012, apparently, China had become the most popular destination for Indian students to study overseas, study MBBS overseas, right? A surprising development. But this is based purely on numbers, right? Numbers of students. And by 2015, so this is the Hindustan Times, and news began to surface that there was certain observation that students from who got their degree from China were not necessarily coming back with very impressive academic performance, and their pass rates at the Indian board exam, medical MCI, Medical Council of India exam, was not very high. So it was flagged as a sort of a quality issue. So these are sort of the background of what was happening there. Okay, so in the next few slides, I'm going to skip through them very fast because they pertain to the field work. But nevertheless, I wanted to show them because there were some slides, some photos that gave you a sense of where this was happening. So this is the university in which I did field work. It's in a provincial capital city in southeastern China. This is the campus that you are seeing. On this slide, only two things worth mentioning. So I'm going to refer to the university I did my fieldwork in as CNU. And at the bottom of the slide, you notice that this university was actually disqualified by the Ministry of Education China after the inspection. So presumably because of quality issues of the quality of the program. It was then reinstated for a few years and then subsequently dropped off the list again, right? So in the last few years, if you look at the list of Chinese universities eligible for recruiting, for offering international MBBS program, this university was not on the list. So it was running, and then it was disqualified. It was reinstated, and then it was disqualified again. Sort of, that's the sort of situation we're talking about here. My field work I did. I spent 2 trips visiting India. Not the kind of traditional ethnography, long, deep, rooted sort of, a stay. Basically, visited. The first trip I visited primarily a few towns, following the students through a few towns in Tamil Nadu. This was a image from the field work, from which I took a photo that I used as the sort of title photo of my slide, where you see this MBBS in China, and in the background you see a few young men. Those were actually my research participants. So this was in Trichy city of Tamil Nadu. I'll say a little bit more about this later. So this was the local agent that I met in Trichy, who was recruiting students on the ground for the Bangalore-based education agency that was sending students to China. So he basically set up his one room in his 3-story house as an office, and in that office you see this board, printed board, where you see a map of China and the number of universities that this agency was sending Indian students to. So he was this was kind of a publicity, right? Marketing. My second trip to India, I visited Kolkata, Bangalore, and that was about it. And in this trip, I managed to get in touch with the Indian-based education agency that was doing all this, student sending and recruiting students and so on. So that was quite insightful as well. And this was early 2016. So that was a very quick sort of idea of what I did in terms of my field work. Now I think time is very limited, so let me dive into my the 2 key terms that I wanted to talk about: compromise and complicity. And the title of my presentation is what I call extra rational logics of international student mobility. First of all, apologies for that very kind of awkward expression, but I think the idea what I was trying to get at is that existing scholarship on international student mobility often draws on a Bourdieusian sort of perspective to interpret student mobility as a strategy of capital accumulation and conversion used by relatively privileged individuals and the families to reproduce their social advantage, social position, right? And this perspective stems from and also reinforces a certain rationalistic and calculative understanding of student mobility. Now, what I saw in my case of following this group of Indian students, primarily from South India, in the city where I did field work, was there were at least two very important discrepancy. The first discrepancy is that these students were certainly not from the typical what you call middle-class family backgrounds. You would think of someone who with parents who are highly educated and so on. So the students that I was in touch with who studied MBBS in China, they came from what you might call emerging middle class or lower middle class. Their parents were mainly, some of them were rural farmers, some of them were doing sort of petty jobs in the town. They were not at all, in any sense privileged. Of course, they are not the worst off in the Indian society, but they, even for the very inexpensive fee, which was the main attraction of the Chinese program, they still could not come up with the cash upfront to pay the tuition fees. So they usually have to either go to a bank to get a loan or borrow money from relatives to fund the study abroad. So that was the first discrepancy. The second discrepancy, and that's probably more important, is that in the dominant social reproduction theory of ISM, which it portrays student mobility and the process of sending students abroad to study as a highly calculative, rationalistic process involving meticulous planning, information seeking, strategizing, a high degree of parental involvement, right? So you have this image of, a highly informed middle-class parents engineering their children's career future by sending them to the right schools and so on. That was not at all what I found in the field work, and that was a huge sort of discrepancy. Now, so let me talk about the two terms I use here, compromise and complicity. By compromise, I mean something pretty straightforward. That this whole thing that is happening is because the students involved were not able to afford better options, right? So before China became a player in this overseas MBBS program, I think those of you who are from India, you would know that countries like Russia and Ukraine, Armenia, these Eastern European countries, Poland, were popular with Indian students. But China came out with an even cheaper offer, right? So you have this. This was from an Indian newspaper, right? BBS in China was cheap. How much cheap? Certainly much cheaper than what you would have to pay, even than compared to having to go to a private medical school in India, right? So these figures are correct as of 2014, but it basically shows how much so that in a sense it's not irrational at all, right? The fact that these students end up in China program, in MBBS program in China, was that because they don't have the economic means. But so this was the basic compromise that led to that. But then, as I observed the lessons, observed the students' sort of campus life, I found out sort of more what you could say irrational, quote unquote irrational processes or decision making. So one of the students told me that he was not at all, and their family had no idea of what China is, and no prior knowledge about China. And the only reason that he ended up in China was because his prior attempt to go to Armenia was failed because of travel document issues. I observed that based on how students recounted their decision-making process, it was often very haphazard, decision-making, rather than the kind of well-informed decision-making that you would expect of people who would, undertake to study abroad, which is a significant investment of time and resources. Now, there is compromise also in terms of admission screening. So the CNU completely did not understand India's complex education exam system. So what they did was they relied entirely on the educational agency in terms of recommending students, which in turn is based on this first pay, first serve basis. So basically, any students who were able to come up with the fees required were so-called booked a place and were sent to these programs. And these students, of course, they were not academically very competitive. Once they landed in China, the receiving universities were also somewhat, so they shared with me that they were a little bit shocked with, how academically unprepared these students were. So it was, a kind of a situation, that kind of situation. And also observed a lot of compromised quality of education in terms of poor, and negligent program management. So there was a case of a few Bangladeshi students who basically missed the entire year of entire academic year, yet they were not given any makeup lesson. They were asked to join the, the last few weeks of that academic year's class and to take exam. On the financial front, the Chinese university told me that a lot of these Indian students failed to pay tuition fee installment, even though it was considered cheap already. So that also was a sort of on the side, also sort of illustrated that these students came from backgrounds of limited financial means.
Sorry,
and then there were, yes.
Peidong, sorry, you
Am
have
I
2
running out
minutes?
of time?
I'm
Okay,
afraid
sure.
so. You have 2 minutes.
Yeah, no problem, no problem. So I mean, so quality of learning and teaching, there was a lot of issue as well. Okay, I'll just talk briefly about what I mean by complicity. Now, how I understood this whole issue and how I came up with this notion of complicity was, I was trying to elicit response from these Indian students, why they ended up here. And I criticized, what I saw as inadequate program inequality in front of the students. I was expecting these students to echo me and join me in criticizing the program. But in fact, what they did wasn't that. What they did was, this was exactly what the one informant said. In fact, we are not top students also, so we cannot have too much high expectation, right? They also know that, so they are just like that. So there was a lot of ellipsis in this unspoken statement in this conversation, and I try to interpret this using this anthropological notion of a complicity. I draw on Hans Steinmuller's idea that complicity is built on a shared self-knowledge that is possibly embarrassing externally, yet it creates a certain solidarity and intimacy between those parties to that embarrassing knowledge, self-embarrassing knowledge, right? So complicity is about maintaining normalcy, respectability, and sociality while avoiding tension and conflict and crisis. So what I'm trying to argue here is that how this whole unlikely student mobility program was held together is that there is a certain unspoken complicity that was going on between different parties of the endeavor. Now, I think I don't have much time. I think I would just focus on one thing, that is the complicity between the students and the university, right? So you already saw from the quote that the students said that they would not complain, even though the program that they were going through were very of problematic quality, that they didn't complain because they knew they had limited choices, right? Other evidence of complicity between the university and the students manifested in things like the lecturers would give review sessions before exam that essentially leaked out the exam questions and papers so that students can pass, right? They turned a blind eye towards students who flout dormitory regulations and so on, and so I think both parties were trying to keep that surface or that veneer of respectability and normalcy while holding together this otherwise sort of untenable sort of situation. I guess I'm running out of time. Yeah.
Yes, but we want to leave some time for questions.
Okay, sure. I think that I will stop there then. Maybe if you have questions, you could.
Thank you. And the good news is that I've added a link to your paper into the chat room there, and people will be able to find out much more detail from that paper there as well. Thank you.
Yeah.
I'm now going to pass over to Sazana Jayadeva, who's just going to briefly add a few comments about the general context before we open for questions.
Great. So I won't take too long because I know there must be questions. So first of all, thank you so much to both presenters. I thought both papers and both pieces of research are absolutely brilliant. And I'm also so glad that we were able to bring them together in one seminar because I think they speak to each other very well. I think both very expertly trouble this idea that is implicit and even explicit in some research studies, but also in broader public narratives, that certain kinds of mobility, for example, urban to rural or international, is usually desirable and also seen as aspirational by migrants themselves, as Carol especially discussed. And also by situating migrants within the broader context of their mobility, I think both papers captured really well how mobilities are not really just a matter of migrants and their families having certain aspirations that are then realized through certain migration infrastructures, but rather that these mobilities are really actively produced in conjunction with migrants and various institutions and actors who all have their own motivations, goals, pressures, which could help us understand to some extent why certain patterns of migration might persist, despite the outcomes being ostensibly quite unfavorable for the migrants themselves. So before I open the floor to questions, I have just one question to Carol and Supriya and one to Peidong. So with Carol and Supriya's paper, I felt that if we see these skill training centers as being, in a sense, labor brokers, I think the paper very usefully shifts the focus from brokers as actors to brokerage as really a process. And I was very struck by Carol's description of how these skill training centers have to raise aspirations. And even in the courses, there's all this focus on success and perseverance. And, you know, it's this real neoliberal narrative of self-help and self-motivation. And I was wondering if you could tell us if these training centers receive any kind of instructions and training to approach migrants in this way, or where this comes from, and if there's any pushback. And also, you mentioned that NGOs have quite a social focus and a social mission. How do they really reconcile high attrition rates and unhappy experiences of migrants with what I don't doubt is a humane motivation for many of them? And with Peidong's paper, I was wondering, what happens to graduates in places like CNU? So you mentioned in the statistics that 80% don't pass this exam, and CNU even got removed from, it got disqualified. So this is quite an obvious failure. So how did they understand their experiences and their investment of time and money in the face of this failure when they come back? And you mentioned this idea of complicity with people who are part of this experience, but how do they present their experiences to those who are not? For example, friends back home and others who might be planning to come to CNU as well. Is there the same, face-saving thing? And in the absence of, clear, successful outcomes like passing the exam and getting a job, do they emphasize other aspects of the process that were valuable? Like in Carol's case, the soft skills that those migrants in Bangalore stressed. Is there something about international exposure and so on? So I'll stop there. So we have enough time for them to answer and other questions. Avril, do you think they should answer these first, or do you think we should take some more questions? I'm also thrilled to see that Supriya is here. Welcome, Supriya.
I think let's start with these questions, and then we'll give people an opportunity to stick their questions in the chat or put their hands up. Okay.
I'm going to ask
Carol, do you want
to answer first, because I already spoke a lot. Supriya, do you want to pick up any of these?
You have to unmute yourself, Supriya. Oh, no.
Yeah. Am I audible?
Yes.
Yeah. So, Susanna, let me take up the second question first, because it's kind of closer to my heart. What is the NGO response, or what's the NGO understanding of what happens to or what's the typical trajectory of the trainee who becomes a service sector employee? I think the NGOs are very intensely aware that they are pushing the trainees, or they're placing the trainees into a very ambivalent space of insecurities, vulnerabilities, more specifically low pay, low working conditions, and very poor civic infrastructure in the places where they live. Now, what is the understanding, or what is there a self-correction mechanism, or is there any thought on this? I think not. I think there is a great deal of understanding, but my impression from interviewing a lot of these NGOs was that they are very well aware of the conditions of the labor market into which they are sending these trainees. And part of their agenda actually, and part of their funding actually comes from the corporates, their corporate social responsibility funding, to have these training programs in order to create a labor force for their establishments. So it's not as if there was no understanding of what they're going to put their trainees in, and that's where their constant harping on lowering the expectations as soon as the trainees come in. So it's I would sort of borrow Dr. Yang's concept of complicity here, because there seems to be an unsaid or an unspoken, unwritten sort of code that this is what they're doing. They are providing free training, free board and lodging for a few months in order to create a labor force for a market which they know is going to create a labor force which is very, very vulnerable. So I don't think there is any question of moral responsibility over here. I think it's a very, very practical arrangement that they're entering into here. So Carol, do you want to take the first question, or should I?
I'm not really sure how to respond to that one. I mean, I agree with what you said, but I'm not sure how to. I don't want to take up too many minutes humming and hawing.
We can also just
yeah.
if you feel like you don't want to respond to it right now, that's fine too.
But I just want to add one thing to what Supriya said about these NGOs. And as you know, at least one of them, was started by these ex-corporate types, right? And it's a very particular class of people who are doing this, starting these NGOs, getting huge amounts of money, not only from corporates, but from, these big foundations to engage in this. And what's interesting is to unpack their narratives is a complete, dismissal of the rural. It's like they literally say there's nothing in the villages for these young people. So they have to get out. So no matter how crappy the job is, at least it's in the city. So I think, that kind of Indian middle class attitude needs to be really targeted here, that, it's as if any job in the city is better than what you might be doing in your village. So it's as if, the 30% have given up on the 70% completely in terms of any type of development or resources and so on. I think we should let Dr. Yang also answer, since we're short on time.
Okay, thank you. I'll just very quickly respond. So after the program, what happens? So yes, the first attempt when these students, they got their degree from China, they go back to attempt the MCI exam, their passing rate is low. So they go for multiple attempts. And what happens is that they would actually sign up on these cram schools that, that is everywhere available, particularly to crack the MCI exam. So it is almost as if the whole purpose of studying in China, spending so much time there, is just to get that degree certificate, MBBS degree, so that they are qualified to be able to take on the MCI exam. Whereas the MCI cram school in India knows how to prepare them best for this. And what's also interesting is that the Indian agency spotted an additional business opportunity here. They know that the Chinese university are not able to teach very well to the Indian students' needs. So other than sending students and getting earning commission, what they also do is they actually created additional supplementary classes to help these students to crack the MCI exam. So that's an additional business opportunity that they've come up with. How do these students and their families sort of present this to others? I think they are sheepish about it. I do think so, but so different participants' sort of situation in the situation is a bit different, right? I saw a lot of silence and complicity between the students and their parents. Their parents, basically ask no question to their children. How is it in China? What is going on? And the children would themselves not dare, didn't want to say too much about, especially the negative aspect of their experience. So, for example, CNU was disqualified. This was something one participant said. It was a heartbreaking thing that he would never, divulge to parents, so that otherwise they would know their investment is really for naught, right? But I think it's interesting. Supriya mentioned this notion of a moral obligation and so on. What I found very interesting in my field work was that the educational agency felt like this whole situation of compromise is basically supply and demand, and they were able to live in a great deal of moral tranquility when they have facilitated these programs, which were of problematic, educational quality and so on. But they would use this discourse of market fundamentalism to say, there's a demand, there is a supply, we are just matching them. We have no responsibility whatsoever. So as a market sort of maker, the agency was able to use this discourse to deflect any responsibility in this case. So in other words, I think if you like, you could say this is a very you could say there is a certain neoliberal logic there, that right, social members are societal members are responsible for their own kind of decision and where they end up. Yeah, just quick response there.
Thank you, Peidong. We're getting close to the end of the time, so I just want to try and squeeze in one or two questions. We have a question here from Khalid Wasim. Khalid, if you don't mind, I'll read that out for you. Khalid said, it was great to see Professor Supriya and Professor Carol after such a long time. And his question is about the impact of CASTE and youth mobility. So has CASTE influenced the aspirations of youth? Did it restrict their job access? And what happens to them after they're attaining their skills? Does it make any changes to their individuals' lives when they go back home?
Really? You want to? I mean, there was one thing I forgot to mention since I was whizzing through, is that when we collected information on the social background of around 100 trainees. And on that basis, I was trying to locate them in terms of social class, education, and so on. And one of the interesting things was that, in fact, the vast majority of these students are either OBCs or SCs. So in Indian lingo, these are the lower caste groups. So clearly they are being tapped not from the landed communities and the politically dominant communities, but even though they're not the poorest of the poor, they definitely come from socially more oppressed backgrounds. And I think I have to still think this through, but I think that has a lot to do with the kind of trajectories that they could put forward for themselves in the city. There was, Supriya can say more about this, but there was, I think, a very strong sense of discomfort in the city for many of them. They're not able to really adjust to that environment, and they were not getting enough help to do that, which has something to do also, I think, with regional, kind of where they come from, and not only the social location of these students. Supriya, do you want to add anything? The question was about the caste and other, background.
Yeah. So, my impression was that they definitely suffered a sense of exclusion, spatial, particularly in terms of the very ghettoized kind of housing which they could access. And that, in a sense, reinforced their sense of exclusion as members of the lower castes. We did see, though, that there was a certain amount of anonymity in the city, as we all know, compared to what there is in rural areas, in terms of how lower caste people feel. I myself haven't studied caste in any great depth. But to me, the bottom line was that this training and this employment was not offering them any kind of significant mobility out of the exclusion and marginalization that they were already suffering as part of the rural lower classes. So Khalid, in answer to your last question, how did they feel when they went back? I think there was, as Carol said, there was a certain amount of discomfort and alienation in the city, and the rural remained a comfort zone in many senses. It also remained kind of a force of gravity, a center of gravity, because they were going back with a certain amount of confidence, because they had been to the city, they had gone through some training, some employment, but also it was a space of care and comfort away from the harshness of what they had experienced in the city. So my final thought on this would be that what we're seeing in this process is a very different, what comes out of this process is a very different understanding of the whole concept of urbanization, which we are used to think in terms of Western paradigms, that it's a unilinear movement, it's a movement in social mobility, it's a step up, so on and so forth. But these sort of taking the train back, so to speak, provides a very, very different understanding of what is actually happening. Thank you.
Okay, we had one last question and that I would like to squeeze in, which is from Dana Borker, about what role do you think, Carol and Supriya, what role do you think higher education institutions can play to ensure youth are directed towards opportunities that are more in favor of their capabilities?
Supriya?
So if by higher education institutions, you mean colleges and universities, like degree colleges and universities,
Yes.
what we saw was these youth had very little access to those kinds of institutions. They had the aspiration, they definitely had the aspiration, but there was very little access. Secondly, those colleges and universities to which they may have access are of very low quality, very regional in character, sometimes rural, semi-rural, and the quality of instruction is very low. So the kind of preparedness that they would have to have a foothold in the urban labor market, since we're talking about urbanization, that foothold would remain very, very fragile. So, I mean, to cut a long story short, the policies on higher education would have to be significantly revamped to make any kind of substantive changes in the lives of these communities.
Thank you. And I'm afraid we're definitely out of time, and I don't want to detain other people who are to detain people at this very busy time. Peidong and Carol and Supriya, there's some comments along the side for you, if you want to follow those up. But right now, it's time for me to thank thank all of our speakers and our discussant today. Thank you for giving us such a fascinating insight into your research. I can't wait to read more and hear more about as your papers come out further. Next week, we will have another seminar, and I hope to see many of you there again. It's the same time, same place, obviously, and we'll be focusing on China and featuring research of Professor Joe Waters from UCL. Thank you so much to everybody. I'm not going to close it for just a moment because I'm going to leave the chat. I want to leave the chat room up here for Carol, Supriya, and Peidong to be able to read.
Thank you.
Thanks
Bye-bye.
so much.
Thanks.